Okay, so basically here is my bubonic plague speech. I'm doing this now, like the very next day, because I wanted to make sure I had everything, and I made sure my script was all ready. So that's why I'm recording it today and not yesterday, because I was really tired. But here is my speech. It's all on paper. There's like, I don't even know how many pages there are. I just wrote and I wrote, probably about 7, just guessing. But it's mostly all on papers. And I'm going to be talking about like the timeline, essentially just a really quick timeline, the different forms of the bubonic plague, what it really was, what was like the main factors, why it was a perfect storm, living conditions kinda, and really where it spread, how it spread, and then basically what came out of it, like, or what was made during it, which there's like 2 really important things there, which I'll discuss, which like at the very end. But just really quickly, the bubonic plague is a bacterium, and it is spread, and the way it was spread throughout the 14th century, which is the 1300s, was from the oriental rat flea. It is also called Xenopisia chiopsis. Chiopis? I don't even know how to say that. Anyway, but basically it is just called also the rat flea. It's about 2.5 millimeters. And it is it's obviously the insects and stuff, but it's like a parasite that would cling onto the rats, which are also called rattus rattus, which actually is really close to something else, which I'll talk about in a second. But the bubonic plague, how it mostly was transmitted was it would get inside the bodies of the oriental rat fleas. Then those fleas would go onto rats and they would bite them, and ferociously too, and over, because the Black Death would not let the fleas consume their food, and it was really hard for them to be get their nutrition. So they would bite a ton just to get their supplements, which would result in many infectious bites for the rat. And then that rat would end up going around and biting humans, or having its like feces or its saliva all over materials that people would use, or just have scrappings wherever, really. And then that's kind of how it started, but there's many different origins. And I honestly might just talk about them now, just so I could get them out of the way. So the possible origins for this bubonic plague, this one didn't happen until later, but people believed that it was stars and planets. And I'm pretty sure that one of the popes, I think Clementine the Sixth, said that an unusual conjunction of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in the house of Aquarius on March 20th, 1345. When these things lined up in a certain thing, it just caused bad luck, and then we got struck with this random illness. This one I'm going to be talking about later, but making eye contact was believed to also have spread it. And this is closely associated with the plague doctors that got birthed essentially from this whole experience, or at least got really popularized. And again, I'll talk more about that because it's very important. And then God himself is one of these things. Many people thought that it was divine punishment, it was God's revenge or God's wrath. And then they also blamed the Jewish people for possibly poisoning the wells. And I heard a story about where, even though this person who was Jewish never did anything, they were being tortured so bad, they just ended up confessing to something they never did. And then that's really what got people going, oh, this person confessed, so they definitely did it. Not true, because they also got infected. One of the ones I first heard was about Lake Issyk-Kul. It's in Kyrgyzstan, or the Kyrgyz Republic, and that place is landlocked. Just a fun fact. But it was believed to come from around there, and mostly it just kind of boiled up until when the conditions were not favorable for it, it was just there because that's where it was most favorable. And then when the conditions worsened in Europe in the early 1340s, then it started to actually make an appearance. And this one I just learned about. Late Mongolia in about the 1320s, there was an outbreak, but only because there was supposedly long periods of rainfall, which forced rat migration, and it brought the rats into contact with nomadic horse tribes and people who were on horseback. And then they lived in the steppes or the steppes, whatever you want to call them. And those were vast, level, treeless expenses of land, and they were located in Central Asia. And that's kind of where the victims had their lives first claimed, but that was also supposed to be in about 1320, 1333 also maybe. And the death toll for this whole thing that I've heard from many sources is Asia had 25 million people die, Europe had 25 million people die as well. And then one other source I saw said that there should have been about 75 million to 200 million people that died. Because again, the bubonic plague didn't just end after 1351, or 1352, which is kind of like what I'm going to be talking about later as well. And it's still alive today. It just doesn't claim as many lives. It only claims about 2,000 people. Not claims lives, but people get infected every year, 2,000 people approximately. So that's just something to keep note. But actually, on with our timeline finally after 7 minutes. In 1346, rumors about a pestilence started spreading around Europe, and that it was so deadly that almost everyone got sick and half of the people died. And it first started in Russia about 1346, and then it spread to China and Central Asia in about late 1346 as well. And people would go around to pubs, caverns, wherever they could, like taverns, my bad, and be like, oh, there's this strange pestilence. I've gotten letters, I've heard it from other people, it's coming to Europe. But many people didn't believe. Some people did, but not a lot of people believed it because they didn't see it or hear it themselves, right? And the way that this really blew up was because in late 1346, a fight between an Italian and a Muslim had gotten really bad to the point where the Muslim died. And the Tartar people who were Muslim, they did not like this at all. So they chased the Genoese to Kaffa, and then they sieged the city walls, but they could not actually break it down because the city walls of Kaffa were known for being very strong and very formidable, which really sucked for the Tartars, no matter how hard they tried. And then suddenly, in early 1347, a strange illness befell the people in the Tartar army, and daily 5,000 people had died almost instantly. Just very spontaneously, 5,000 people died. Since the Tartar army was blocking off the Italians in their city, they began to run out of resources, and many Italians began to flee Kaffa using galleys. But before that happened, the Tartar army, since they were dropping, they were issued by their leader to get catapults, launch the disgustingly smelling bodies into Kaffa just as a bit of revenge. If they can't get in, they'll bring something disgusting to their city, which was the diseased, infected bodies, some of them were at points of decay, and some of them actually were filling up with gas, so that when they landed in the city of Kaffa, they exploded and their body parts went everywhere, which is very disgusting. And it's one of also the major points of the outbreaks in Kaffa. So, the bodies were catapulted into Kaffa, and the bodies went everywhere. And the rats and the fleas, since they had started to infect the Tartar army, once the rats were already in the city at this point, many rats were already in the city, but the fleas were clinging onto bodies since they could cling on to they have such a strong grip, they cling onto anything, which would be the dead bodies flying through the air, and landing in Kaffa. And then once in there, they just kind of spread. And not even like a week or two later, they were already devastating. The results were devastating. It was so bad very fast. The sick and infected gathered onto the 12 galleys in the ports and sailed off, seemingly unscathed. But it would all get very bad very fast. As for infected, rats were under the docks and fleas clung onto the rats themselves and onto the clothing of the citizens of Kaffa, that is. And just for that whole thing, basically, what they realized that the Tartars weren't leaving anytime soon, no matter how bad they were getting infected. So many of them started to flee, and the very first destination that they would go to would be Constantinople, which is like basically across the Black Asian Sea place. I honestly don't even remember what it's called. The Black Sea, I think. I remember it's something with an A, but they traveled across that sea, and Constantinople was there, and they all got there. And that is the second kind of main point of the outbreak, and essentially it just kind of goes to absolute heck, throughout. But the galley stopped at Constantinople in early 1347, and they began to rapidly spread in the late summer of 1347. They arrived in Constantinople, and cases were already being reported. It already broke out, and then confirmed in late 1347. That's when it was confirmed to have already been spreading south, honestly anywhere it could go, it did go. And they actually traveled about 1.5 to 6 miles per day, which it's really far. Like the disease for that's like far. And keep in mind that most of the spreading was by fleas and rats, which is a lot for a flea, and a lot for rat, which actually I don't know much for a rat. Rats can be pretty they can go pretty far. Because of this, Constantinople was in ruin. Here's a quote from Demetrios Kydones. "Every day we bring out our own friends for burial. Every day the city becomes emptier and the number of graves increases. Men inhumanely shun each other's company for fear of contagion. Fathers do not bury their own sons, and sons do not perform last duties for their fathers." I got this from a video I watched. So, fun fact, but that is basically what would happen when people get sick. They'd either be locked inside, which again I'll talk more about later, or they would be stuck with their very sick families, or the families who were completely healthy would be taking care of another family member, and then all of them would get sick just from one person, because they never knew proper bacteria. Like, they don't know anything about bacteria. They know nothing. And antibodies didn't come out until about 600 years later, so there was no chance that they were getting anything from that, which is why a lot of the treatments would not work, or at least most of the time. If they did work, a lot of the time it wouldn't work all the time. From the city of Bosphorus, Constantinople, it spread inland in two directions: northwest, more very commonly northwest, and then east. The galleys from Kaffa weren't done though, as they continued to sail south towards Sicily. Now this is where this is very important as well. They arrived at Sicily in about October of 1347. And in Sicily, there was the first official documented records of the plague. And when the 12 galleys docked in Sicily, or more specifically Messina, Sicily, they were ordered to turn away after an inspection. But it was already far too late, as for the rats and the fleas had already escaped off the boats and gotten into the cities. Months later, after it arrived at Sicily, it actually spread up north towards Rome and Florence. And in Sicily, it was bad, very bad. And they had about 1/3 of their population that died, which is very bad. On average, the plague was suspected to have moved, as I said before, moved about 1.5 to 6 miles per day, but it can move through people, which is also how it might have, that's why it's either really small distances or really far distances, which is why it might have traveled faster during the summer or the winter, but also that's due to like how close and how far people are, or what or the conditions that are favorable for these for like the fleas and the rats and the disease itself. From the galleys, they made their way to many more places. One example is Genoa, where, with a population of 90,000, 30 to 40% had died. So just assuming, since 45 is half of 90, I would assume that 40% is like, I would say it's about 35, maybe 37, like 37,000 people might have died, which is still a lot. So not too far from Genoa was actually the city of Marseille, where it served to spread the plague into France. Fancy. But Marseille was, when it entered Marseille, it obviously put the place to ruin, but that was one of the biggest points for how it entered into France. Once the bubonic plague hit places like Genoa, Pisa, Venice, and other seaports, it traveled across the Italian peninsula. And unfortunately for Italy, it seemed to have high death rates, like one of the highest. And it just traveled there about the winter of 1347 to early 1348. This one is a bit iffy because nothing I found ever really specified it, but nothing here is really confirmed. That's why the dates are so weird, because it's so far back and nobody really documented the dates. They mostly would document who dies, and other really unimportant stuff when it comes to here, like this. Giovanni Villani, not to get confused with Giovanni Boccaccio, he was a chronicler, and he thought that about 60% of Plague Florence, which that was the name that it was given because of how bad it was, that he thought 60% of Plague Florence died. And here is Giovanni Boccaccio. So Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian writer, wrote of tales and very famous stories. And one of them was the Decameron. The stories in this book are not real. They are actually just pure fiction. But the only reason that historians actually use this is because the descriptions and events that happen in this books, like, they are very accurate to what happens in real life. So they're the best way to kind of go, we believe this happened and this happened, because there was not a lot of information at all. And the only people that would document it are the people who ever got schooling on how to read and how to write, and basically just learn the language, which very few people did, which is why there's barely any records of the bubonic plague. The reason Florence was in such a terrible state during the Black Death was because it began to terrorize Florence. It began to terrorize Florence, with its really unfavorable conditions. But the things that happened before made it just worse. And just some examples was, it was going through famine due to the high population. Floods were a terrible thing. There were horrible crop yields. And the horrible weather also made it really hard to harvest crops, but also made the crops get ruined. And that's why it was so devastated when it came into contact with the plague. And to make matters worse, many farmers ran away in Florence and would leave their crops unharvested, and many more people would starve due to this. And on top of it all, many who brought the virus, many of the people who left actually brought the virus to other places wherever they went, which would wipe out cities, other cities and towns, which unfortunately was really devastating for those places. And around the winter of 1348, the plague seemed to have ended. But that's just for Florence, or just about Italy in general. Due to people fleeing and ships and trading and all, after Italy was first struck, it ended up traveling to places like Barcelona, Spain, Marseille, which I already talked about, France, and Tunis, which is actually in North Africa. As I said, Marseille was the entry point to France for the plague, and the plague attacked France in the summer of 1348. And since France was Europe's most populated city at the time, like just in Europe in general, that places were left devastatingly empty. Like, if it was a small place, mostly everybody would die for sure. But when you have such a big population and many of your people die, like about half your population, it would go from a large amount of people to barely anybody, and all of your land and your space would just be empty, and it'd be horrible for your population. France lost 50% of its 50,000 people to the plague. And it was worse because in November and December, about 800 people died per day. And that's just from 1348 to 1349. Good tea. And possibly late 1348, like early or late 1348, or even like the summer of 1349. I've heard from 2 different sources, so I'm going to assume it's the summer of 1349 because that's what I saw most commonly. The pestilence reached North Germany, Prussia, Poland, and Hungary. And for Poland, I do want to specify it had one of the lowest death rates, but that's only because it had such harsh conditions for the plague. If you were found out to be infected with the plague, and it wasn't just Poland, but this is just one of the examples, but if it was discovered that you had the plague, you would be locked up inside your house with your family members, and you would be trapped in there, and there'd be like X's on your doors, which was actually specific as well to London, which I'll talk about in a bit here. But you were basically boarded up with your family, and then released after like 40 days, which is actually something I want to talk about a bit as well. 40 giorni means 40 days in Latin, which is how we kind of got the words quarantine from. So essentially, you'd be put in quarantine, which is 40 days, and loads of people did not survive. Many people did not survive. There was almost no chance you were getting out. Because even if you were separating yourself from the affected, if a flea had bitten them and it was still in there, it could totally still get you if you had no contact with the sick. Something like that is so possible, which is also why many people would not be able to leave their houses because they would never make it out alive, which is horrible. But Poland had one of the lowest death rates at, I think, about 15%, which is very good for a population of its size. Throughout this horrible outbreak, the people of places like Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and countries of Scandinavia seemed to be safe from the virus, either because they, did not get it sent their way, which would totally happen, which is kind of what happened in Scandinavia, or in places like England, where they had the safety of the English Canal, separating it from the mainland of Europe, which ends up becoming really important later as well, because even though it was separated, it still knew its time was coming. It's just that they didn't know when. They knew it would happen, they just did not know when. But that's why many people got very ignorant, because they thought, oh, it could never reach us. We could possibly not get infected because we're safe by this canal. And unfortunately, though, it finally came to them in about August of 1348, when a French ship carrying cargo had docked at Melcombe, Dorset, or Weymouth for today, today's day. It was an immediate outbreak, and just a week later, Bristol reported an outbreak as well. It was horrible. With South England possessing many open fields, it was very easy for people to escape, but it's also what caused more outbreaks in England, because it was also a very big vector for black rats to bite people, or for fleas to cling on to people and bite them as well. By November of 1349, the plague entered London and killed approximately 40 to 50%. The population dropped so much that they weren't able to reach their pre-bubonic plague population until for another 175 years. So their population dropped so far that their population did not, like, I think they had 100,000. I might be wrong on that. I feel like I'm wrong about it, but their population wasn't able to go any higher than it was until 175 years later. So that would basically just be like the 15th century. No, the 16th century, about the 1500s, which might be. The Scots heard about the English people dying and decided that they would attack them. But the joke was actually on them because they contracted the disease and it was devastating on them. And just to get two birds with one stone, the English actually came and killed them. They chased them down and got them. And to make it even worse, anybody that did survive and went back to their city brought the plague with them. And it devastated them. And then it actually carried over to Ireland from the Irish Sea. And by 1350, the plague crossed the North Sea and entered Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Just little thing. And it actually happened to reach Iceland and Greenland as well, and probably by ship. By 1351, the worst of the plague was seemingly over, but it does not mean it's gone forever. As I said earlier, that I said I would mention, that I think I said I mentioned later, about 2,000, 3,000 people, like 1,000 to 2,000 people get infected per year, and then 500 people seem to die every time they get it. And that's just because there's so many forms, that it's actually crazy. So here's the timeline, about 4 or 5 pages. And then here's my origins. So I want to talk about the forms, which is something I was kind of excited to talk about. And I would leave it for last, but it's very, very important to the story. I got this from healthline.com, and here's basically the different forms. There's 3 of them. So the forms of the plague are the bubonic form, which takes about 2 to 8 days for you to get your first symptoms. It's the most common form, and it's shockingly the most safe form, even though the death rate is 60%, which means you are more likely to die than survive. And it doesn't mean people never survived. Obviously, people survived if the death rate is 60%. It's just that it was so bad that you are more likely to get it and die than to get it and survive. Just going to talk about something really quickly with one of the symptoms, just in a minute here. Actually in a second here. Some of the symptoms included fevers, chills, headaches and body aches, weakness and fatigue, dizziness, swollen and very painful lymph nodes, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and delirium. I don't see anybody talking about it, but I watched a documentary the other day, and it was talking about a small place called Im in Europe, and they actually survived. Many people, like half the population in that small town with about, I think, 900 people survived. But I will get onto that later because it's not very important for now. And it was spread by fleas, and very rarely was it actually spread by infected material from an infected person. Very rare. If it was untreated, it would move to the lungs, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about, which would be the pneumonic form. And it could also, if that built up as well, it could spill into your bloodstream, which would be the septicemic form. I'm going to talk about the pneumonic form right now. The pneumonic form, you would get your symptoms in about 1 to 3 days, which is very fast. The death rate is very, very high. It is 95 to 100% fatal. You are very unlikely to survive this. Again, it doesn't mean that people have not survived. It just means it's extremely rare to survive. The symptoms include chest pains, cough, fever, headaches, overall weakness, bloody sputum, which is essentially just saliva and mucus or pus from the lungs, which is disgusting and sounds very painful, and once again, delirium. This one is airborne, and it is very infectious. Somebody could cough and walk away, and you walk into their cough literally like 30 seconds later, and you could still contract the disease, which is why it's so infectious. This is also the only form known to have human-to-human transformation. As for the other one, which I'll talk about in a second here, but it's very rare, very, very rare. This one, the next one I'm talking about is one that spills into the bloodstream, which is the septicemic form. So, something really quickly I'm going to address here is when the bubonic plague enters your body, it takes over your white blood cells, and then it makes its way into the lymph nodes, and then that's kind of where it rapidly multiplies, and then takes over your immune system, which totally screws you over. I shouldn't say that, but that's how it is. It screws you over, and that's really how it gets to you. And something I do want to talk about here is with earlier when I mentioned that that there was a town called with about 900 people and half of them survived. How did they do it? Even though like a ton of people got sick, was because there was a strain called Delta 32, and it was essentially like an antibody against the bubonic plague. And many of these people actually got to survive due to the plague. Like there's one story of a lady named Elizabeth, I don't remember her last name, and all of her family died except for her because she had the bubonic plague. But I'm pretty sure this version was way later down in the timeline of the world, when the very next bubonic plague outbreak ever, like the big one ever happened. Yummy. But the Delta 32 strain only happened to seem to really come from that town, which is really amazing. That's something I thought I'd address because I thought it was a really cool fact. And another lady, she survived because apparently she drank bacon fat, which was like in liquid form. She drank bacon fat. And because she was really thirsty. She was delirious. She ran, got a jug of bacon fat, and drank it. And she was also known to have survived until, she obviously dies later, not due to the plague, though. Just a fun little fact I thought I would mention. And there were people who did survive the plague, and with the lymph nodes that I thought I'd talk about earlier with the bubonic plague, like the most common form, if they get something like their lymph nodes would swell, or there would be like tumors on their body, it could cause it could cause this body disfigurement. Which, example, if there was something here on your neck, boom, and somebody's head would be always tilted sideways for the rest of their life until they die. And it's really, really gross. I mean, no offense to them, but it would be also really uncomfortable and painful. And your lymph nodes, like example, in your armpits, your groin, and one thing I saw would be like behind your ears, kind of here on your cheekbone. That one I also saw, which was common. They would grow, they could turn purple, they could bleed out with pus and blood, and it's honestly very disgusting, and it's also really highly infectious if it were to be popped, and which is something I'll talk about when it comes to cures, because there is a mention of that. And sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Septicemic form. This version is so deadly that when you show symptoms, it could be as early as 14 hours to 3 days, which means you could see your friend or a family, say hi, we'll visit you the very next day, you go to bed, you wake up, and you're dead. Well, actually, you wouldn't even wake up, you'd just be dead. The death rate was almost 100%. From one source I heard, it was so fatal, nobody survived. And from other sources, there was maybe 1 or 2 people that survived. Just very rare though. Like, extremely rare. Like, you definitely would not be one of those 2 lucky people. It's that impossible. And I actually just really want to quickly say this. The pneumonic form, if you left it untreated, you'd probably either die or, once again, it would spill into the bloodstream and get the septicemic form. Just really quickly pointing that out. And the symptoms were abdominal pain for septicemic form, diarrhea, nausea and vomiting, fever and chills, extreme weakness, bleeding, and because the blood might not be able to clot, skin turning black, which is a gangrene system, gangrene? I don't know how to say it, but that's for later. Put a pin in that. And shock. And basically, if you had so much blood, if you had so much of the virus spill into your bloodstream, you'd go into septic shock, I believe, and you would die. There's nobody who is recorded to survive from this. It's impossible. It would be, you could get a cut, and you get it infected, and you get sick from that, and you die from a paper cut. Back in the olden days, there's no way somebody's surviving from having septic shock. Because again, there's no antibodies, really horrible medical stuff, and also really painful. No anesthesia, nothing like that, right? So it's very, very painful. And if you left this untreated, there's no surviving it. You're dead. There's no surviving it. The first 24 hours, though, if you got any of these, was in fact treatable. It was very treatable, in fact. But back in their day, right, you never actually could get really proper treatment because we have antibodies for this stuff now. Like 80% of people, when they get the antibodies, they end up being just fine, right? Other people might go on to suffer other symptoms, but might honestly just be fine, right? It's mostly treatable if you get it done very, very fast. If you get infected, immediately seek medical attention, like immediately. Don't try anything natural. It's known to have very bad results. Go to a doctor, go to a hospital, put a mask on, make sure you're clean, wear like robes and stuff. Go to a hospital, say you believe you've contracted the bubonic plague, put me in isolation, please test me. And results can actually show up in 2 hours, which is a fun fact, if you're trying to get immediate results. If you're trying to get like more better results, it could take up to like a day, which is not very good if you're like in the septicemic, if you have the septicemic version, but many people, like almost nobody gets it now. Yeah, that's basically like, it's very treatable, but back then it really wasn't. And here is why I'm mentioning gangrene, because many people believe that the Black Death wasn't just one thing, it was three different viruses that basically turned it into like a plague. I don't know if gangrene's a plague, forgive me on that. But the main three that were suspected are Ebola, anthrax, and I don't know if it's internal or just normal, but just gangrene. So that's basically what the plague was supposedly made out of. And it can also cause meningitis, which not fun. But the something I really want to point out here is with anthrax, that's what people believed caused the purple boils and stuff like that. Because the boils would be swollen lymph nodes, but anthrax would basically like turn them purple essentially and just make them very uncomfortable and painful, right? That's why they're painful and that's why they're purple. They didn't actually start turning purple until later, I believe, which is why people were like, oh, it must have been 3 different things because it would have turned purple in the beginning. Just kind of a little thing to throw out there. And honestly, that's really it for the different stages of it. Most people are noted to get the bubonic form, and very rarely have people got the pneumonic form. So, and here is now one of the most biggest things to come out of it. I mentioned way earlier in this video essay that the reason I'm mentioning that plague doctors are so important, but one of the very first things that I mentioned was because okay, I don't even honestly remember. So I'm just gonna blab a bit here, but this is one of the things that came out of the bubonic plague when I mentioned in the very, very beginning of my introduction, when I said, oh, and then here are some things that came out of it. one of these things was plague doctors. And I know that I heard one source which said it came from way earlier, but one of the main prominences of this, this is so important because this is how it really transpired. Also, really quickly, and then here's for the different forms. But the plague doctors, what they essentially wore was they'd wear very big cloaks, and normally they were like really thick cloaks as well. And in this case, normally they were black, to give just because it looked mortifying. It looked like death, essentially. And they'd have really thick boots so that they wouldn't step on anything, and they would also protect their skin because, obviously you don't want to get the plague yourself. And they also had very, very thick gloves. They'd have layers of gloves. Which I'm pretty sure a lot of this stuff was made out of leather. And then they'd have, crow mask, which is one of their most iconic things. They would have a crow or a bird mask, and their eyes would be offset. And earlier I mentioned that, one of the ways people thought it would spread is through eye contact. That's why the eyes on the bird masks are offset, because they believed if you had eye contact with your person or you looked at them directly, you would get infected. So that's why they're offset. And they also had the lens, the glasses inside of the lenses were actually red, and they were made out of crystal. They were originally clear and they were made out of glass, but they changed it up, and it was also honestly just a feature look, just cause. But I personally believe it also might have been to make it harder to make eye contact with your person, or for them to make eye contact with you. So that might have been something that they might have believed. And they also had nose holes in their bird masks. So if you would imagine if I was wearing a bird mask, they have nose holes and stuff so that they can still breathe. But it would be very tiny so that, obviously they wouldn't get the plague. And inside, actually, the beaks of those bird masks, they would have either the complete opposite. They'd either have really nice smelling herbs that would cure you and heal you and stuff like that, or they would have the most disgusting smelling herbs. I would not want to smell that, but they were meant to offset the horrible smells, and basically just not put your attention to it, because they also believe that, breathing it in was totally going to get you infected, but if they had that stuff there, then, it would, it might actually cure you. Now, speaking of curing, here's some cures. Bloodletting. If you don't know what bloodletting is, it's when they would take, when you basically have the lymph nodes and stuff. Just imagine I have something on my armpit. You'd have your lymph nodes, and they would use hot pokers, and they would jab it into your armpit, or essentially wherever you have your lymph nodes, and it would be jabbed into them, and then the blood would spill out. As you can imagine, no anesthesia, no nothing. It was very painful, and many times it either, 1, made their infection worse, 2, made their infection so bad it killed them, 3, they lost so much blood it killed them, or actually got everywhere, and then made it really infectious to be around, which definitely killed a few plague doctors, which I'm gonna assume, which was probably a lot, because it didn't work many times, and other doctors who weren't wearing stuff like that would totally, almost many times out of 10, get infected. So that's why, and it did work, actually. There were times where it really did work, but that was about half the time, or less than half the time. And then, that's also what I'm mixing it up with fire, and then fire pokers for bloodletting, because you could just use something sharp and poke it, and then fire pokers were also used, just hot rods poked into the skin. So you can either use something normal and cool and sharp, or use something burning and sharp and poke it, which would hurt both ways, but one's more painful than the other, very clearly. And then fire. Fire was used to ward off the plague, and the best thing about it is it actually worked on warding off the fleas. Pope Clementine VI actually would sit beside his patients, or people that he would help treat, and he was never recorded to have gotten the plague. Well, it was recorded that he never got it, but he never once got it, which is incredible. And for the rich people, one of the main things that was told, like, oh, here's what you can use to heal yourself, was crushed sapphires, and I don't know why they would ingest that, but obviously it didn't work. I've never heard one case where it worked. Just pointing that out. And then herbs and plants were very, very common as well. People would go out, they'd pick their plants, and they'd stock up during the winter, and then just make things even worse. Many times out of 10, it did not work. I mean, it really would in any way. But because it was also like they'd have no knowledge on what any of these herbs or plants were, or what they meant, what they do, because the city of France was one of the most educated places in the world, right? They were known for their science and their like botanist stuff, whatever, like stuff to do with flowers and plants and whatnot. They knew way more about that than anybody in Europe did. They were one of the most knowledgeable people about it. Oh, and then very commonly people would pray, and I can guarantee you praying would not actually work to get rid of a plague. So that's just something I'm going to point out. Many people, loads of people prayed. Loads of people. It doesn't matter which god or which deity or whoever they prayed to. It did not work to ward off the plague when it came to it like getting inside your body. You can pray for the safety of yourself and your health and your family or your friends or whoever and whatever. But if it got into your body, there's no praying that off. It's mostly just you have to either hope to survive, depending on what you have, or you use the resources that you have available to actually get it out of your body. And just also, really quickly, this one can get a bit graphic, so I don't know if I'm gonna get in trouble for this, but excusez-moi, lo siento for this, I don't know. But basically, there was a group called the Flagellants, and these were a group of people who were either called cross brethren or crossed brothers. And basically, they were a group of people that started in Germany and actually would gain up to like 40,000 people, which is a ton of people. And they would go around to towns and cities, convince other people to join them while they whip themselves, they cry, they pray, they burn themselves, they attack other people, more specifically Jewish people, because that's who they targeted and blamed, which I'm going to get into a bit here. And what some of the things they do, as I've already literally just said, is they travel across Europe. They would whip themselves with like very like aggressive whips. They would use whips that were made of like leather, and they were called flagelos. I don't know how to say that, so excuse my accent. And it would be like 3 knotted leather thongs, and yes, that's what it said. And it'd be pierced by small iron nails, which if you can imagine, very painful. And what they do is they go across Europe and just do a little fun fact. They would use candles and lights during the nighttime, as if nobody would ever do that. But one of the main things that they had is they would preach about God, and then they also would preach about the death of Jewish people. They had very anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish beliefs. And if they actually found people who were Jewish, they would attack them, which is very aggressive. And again, this all started in Germany, which might have honestly been one reason for a certain person getting power and blah, blah, blah. But they were very aggressive. They would attack, they'd burn, they'd torture. It's horrible. I don't know if I already said this or not, but there was a story about a guy, who got tortured into saying, yes, we Jewish people, we poisoned the wells, but they never did. So unfortunately, they were blamed for that. And again, I don't know if I already said that because this thing's about to reach like 50 minutes. So I don't remember. And something they did was they wore black cloaks, or cloths, and they would wear cowled hoods, and then they would also wear felt hats that would cover their eyes, and they'd carry wooden crosses, and they would chant hymns. It's very, had a hard time reading that. My writing's very messy, but that's what they would do, is they'd go around and they'd whip themselves, they'd cry, they'd beg, they'd preach, they'd convince people to join them. And shockingly enough, people actually joined them. Seeing this disgusting stuff, they would join them. They'd get naked or they unclothe themselves for the most part. They'd do all this bad stuff. They'd sacrifice people and be like, join us, God says so, or whoever I'm praying to says so, blah, blah, blah. And so many people join them. And it's crazy. And the really and the thing is that there was no way they weren't getting the bubonic plague. Many of people in this flagellance died from the bubonic plague. And the way you knew that they had already passed by, from what people had said from sources I heard, was if you see trails of blood and trails of dead people and items and cargo and just trails of if you knew it was the flagellants that had passed by, you could see bodies, cargo, people, sometimes animals as well, but it would just be like trailing, following them, and I'm gonna be honest, I don't even know what happened to them at the end, but I'm just gonna assume that many of them died and that eventually at some point it just dispersed once it officially kind of ended, when people were like, oh yeah, no, we totally didn't do that during this time, we're totally normal. Yeah, but for, like, honestly, that's really it for my whole thing. And I'm only doing this now because I really love making long videos. I don't know if I'll be able to send it by Teams. If I can, I'm sending it by Teams. If not, I'm putting it on YouTube. But that's really it for my thing. On my papers, I had 2 books. One was called The Black Death, and then one was essentially just like, like the bubonic plague, like just basically 2 books about them. And they're in my sources, which I'll send, but really that's it. Like I just thought I'd make something special, but I don't even know what to say. Something I do really want to mention is the bubonic plague. People have found, like, there's only like, people have, like, obviously researched and done their stuff, but there are still so many other things that we've not discovered about the bubonic plague, and the timeline is pretty inaccurate. None of this is totally accurate for sure, because again, it was literally like almost 1,000 years ago, 900 years ago, and it's like very hard to get records and stuff. But I watched many documentaries online. They're very brutal, like on YouTube specifically. I read many online stories. I found many quotes. I read many books, read many papers, off memory, had my own research. Yeah, and honestly, that's it. Pete my tea, headband for long working hours. I think I've already done all this before. And then pee my cat, I guess. And honestly, yeah, that's it. This is my speech. Hopefully I can get that produce, for good, unique content. Sorry it's late, but that's basically it. And that's basically the final thing I'm giving you as my assignment. So I'm basically done. Bye.